Hey, what's up, Liron here. Thank you for joining me in today's video. I want to share with you the painting process of that Fabergé egg I painted. A lot of people have been asking about it and were curious to see especially how I approached the sketching stage. So I will share with you all of that and more. Here it is. In case you haven't seen it, I posted it pretty much everywhere on Instagram, here on YouTube. As well, but let's go over the stages and figure out how this was painted. So here is the sketch stage. Now I actually went ahead and traced, as I often do with these kinds of paintings, very complex, full of details. I actually am zooming in on the top left corner almost of the Fabergé egg. It's not the entire egg. And the eggs are quite small, by the way. They look huge in this painting, but they're actually quite small. It specifically looks very small here. The way I did the tracing was I put a piece of paper on my computer monitor and just traced. Now, I did it later when there was no light from outside and I could rely on the light of the computer to really work like a light table. And I also usually tend to have I have two monitors, right? So I tend to have one where I trace and the other, the same exact picture open, so that if I don't see through the paper well enough, that way I can complete the details or fill them in. Now let me zoom in a bit so you can really see here. This was basically drawing a grid for all these gems, but you'll notice I also have right above there where the if you continue this line here, I have two small squares where it says M. That's for magenta. That was specific to gems that really caught my attention, and I knew that focusing on those will help me orient myself, because it's just a grid with tons of little gems and details. And of course, and you can see it in the reference photo, I probably show it as well, probably edit in post editing, but it's just a grid. It's basically a grid of a lot of small stones, and some parts of the grid have no stones in them, so it's just a hole. But I did want to mark a few key stones, so that will help me find my way around it. And then we get to work, basically starting to paint these one by one. My goal was to see whether I can achieve the final value for each of these ones, instead of working in a layer first for all the gems and then a layer for all the shadows on the gems and so on and so forth. I actually wanted to finalize them. I did work in groups, so if there are a lot of blue gems one next to another, I painted the whole group. Maybe I left some highlights for the grid in between them, and I carefully added wet and wet for what I could, and then once it dried and I couldn't work anymore, I let it dry and then add another layer of shadows. Now we can actually zoom in and see some more of the details. Nothing too fancy when you look at it this way, but you have to understand this is a lot of small effort that together is consolidated into one big piece of art. A lot of it comes down to the overall context of the gemstones. You'll see later on there's actually a pattern of light and shadow on them. So some of the gemstones are towards the edges of the rounded edges of the egg are a little darker. If you capture that pattern, it will read as one object. You will see this a bit later on. You can also see that layer of pearls where I started painting it. I used a variety of approaches for the pearls. Sometimes I would pre-wet the dot in the middle, like I showed you in one of the recent YouTube videos, I think the most recent one, and paint around it to leave a highlight in the middle. But because it's so tiny, it didn't always work, so you see some areas didn't work that way. For some of these, I just painted around a highlight, left a sharp edge, then came back with a blending brush and blended these out. For some of them, I did multiple layers, and only at the end I blended them out, but it was like a hybrid process for these. Tedious, grueling, slow, step-by-step for all of them. It's just a complex piece of art. The brown, by the way, areas for the gemstones is the empty cells, the empty parts of the grid where no gemstones were placed. Then you can actually see through them. Most of them are just dark. I decided to mark them as brown so that I know where to darken more in the next steps. Now, so let's look at another step, and this is where I completed that layer. Pretty much 100%, not fully, because you will be able to see later on that I shade again. The lower, it's like a stripe. The lower part of the stripe goes darker, and the sides of it go darker as well, where the center is the part that's hit by the most light. And if you can get that pattern, it will read really, really well. One more thing I got was that gemstone up at the top, so let's zoom in on that. The only real large area with wet and wet on the egg excluding the background, which we'll get to in a second. This was really the only section where I pre-wet and carefully worked my way around it, adding a lot of pink and blue and so on. I've been using my normal palette, but I did add to that Mission Gold, was it? All sorts of colors. Thank you so much, Marjorie, for sending me that palette and many others. It helped me a lot with those bright magenta colors. It helped me a lot with those because I didn't have the right bright enough pink color, let's say. Something like an opera pink or something that really sings. You need those things here. Even though a lot of it is contextual, still there were some very bright colors that I just had to use. There was no way to get around it. So yeah, I pretty much enjoyed putting that gemstone. The way I treated this process was, and you'll see in a second, after working on so many of these small stones, it was such a relief to have like this wavy pattern down below where I could do some larger, not huge, but larger areas in between the waves to just paint behind them. And because after you're working, and you see I added the top part as well. So a couple of things here. First, this wavy pattern, it was just a blessing finally to paint larger areas, not just small, tiny grids of gemstones. So that's the first thing. Then I also painted this thing up above, all the bright stones up above. Lots of greens, lots of magentas, and permanent rose, I believe, is the color there. And then there's the lower gold section below, and also a very thin wash inside those waves. Now, at this stage of the process, it's a weird in-between purgatory where you've done so much work, you put so much effort into it, but you're still unsure whether it's going to work out as a whole. And that is perfectly okay. The artwork reveals itself very gradually, and it's almost up to you to stick through it, not by force, not by forcing yourself, but to stay along for the ride until the end result arrives naturally on its own accord. That's how I usually end up doing these paintings. So just a note, if you're working on something that's very grueling, but you want to do it, you want to paint it, you want to, that's one of those things that, you stay along for the ride and you reach the end result. It will just reveal itself. Now for this gold line, I added in the middle. You see there a lighter section because that's where, again, the light shines on the center of the egg from where we're looking at. The light comes from the front. The sides are going to be darker. So that part is the lightest. You'll notice also that already the gemstones here in this strip, the central strip, already they're brighter in the center, darker and more muted on the sides. Notice how this section right here, the closest to my finger, and all the way on the other side, they're more muted, right? You can tell. I think we should have a zoom in for this. Oh no, where it's just the next stage. But yeah, all of these areas on the side are more muted. You can tell a bit of dim violets and so on. Now I want to go into the background here. One thing in the previous stage, let's go back for a second. We still don't have any context for the shininess. Oh, by the way, one more important thing. You see the grid that's between the gemstones? I started painting that too. So some parts of the grid I left the same, but especially on the topmost layer, you'll see some areas of the grid I have added a shadow to them. Not everything. Some parts stayed paper white, but some parts got a golden shadow. And on around the areas, the peripheries, the sides here and on the other side, it's golden, it's darker. So that's another factor that reflects the light. But in any case, right now we don't have context for the lights. We don't have context for the shininess of the jewels because we don't have a background. Soon as we add a background, things start to fall into place. Now, not only did I add a background here, obviously I also painted the lower shapes. Now for these, you see me doing a more looser approach. I paint several of the stones together just because there's so much going on there. It's all consolidated together because it's also darker around the bottom that I could pretty much, afford it to paint them in one go and kind of see where it leads me. I also painted some of the gemstones in the wave pattern. You'll see there's a main blue one and some yellow ones and the green ones also within the shadowy areas. And I also go over the pearls multiple times and just add a bit of a darker shape to the center of the pearl, leaving the frame around it, the golden frame, a little lighter. The pearls honestly were a huge challenge, probably the hardest part of this painting and the part that really threw me off so much. I kept sampling the colors in Photoshop and not believing what I see, and the values were very confusing. But I think they end up working in the grand scheme of things. Now, if you look at this row of pearls right here, you'll see it has hard edges. Also, the one below right there, it has a lot of hard edges. That's something you will see in a second. I'm blending with my blending brush. But with that said, I did add a background that gives us more context, that gives us more clarity. It also builds the shape of the egg, because so far we didn't really have a shape for it. And also it suggests a few colors. Now, I started relatively bright here. You can see some reds, you can see some violets, some blues, and then some yellows to the right. The more I add layers to this background, the more muted I'm going to make it, thus letting the gemstones shine more. Because right now, it's still competing with them for the colorfulness, and that is fine. So let's go over to what I believe is the final stage. So a lot of things have changed here. If you'll notice, I basically darkened everything. The wavy pattern. Look at the wavy pattern before and after, right? I'll look at the pearls after and before. Look at the entire lower section right here before and after. And of course, the background. Look at that. I also did so many minor tweaks here, you know, darkening some more of the empty parts of the pattern, painting carefully around the highlights and the lower sections. I also added very thin, you see the white stripes, like there's a white stripe between the pearls from above them and below them. Same here and there. It's like a wave pattern and then also a rounded strip pattern. I added to its sides. It's barely noticeable, but I darkened them with a bit of gray so that the center of the egg is the part that shines the most. Try and see if you can catch it. I'm going to go back. Look at the white gaps between the pearls and all of the other details. Now look at them. See the sides, they're gray. Especially if you look at, okay, let me see where I can point you to it. Yeah, especially this section right here, the white lines that move a little down like that. Look at them now and look at them after. I really darkened them with gray. Same on the other side of the egg. Darkened the background, of course, added my signature. But one more thing is I blended some edges of the egg itself. And we can zoom in and see here. Look at the left side right here. See this? I find that when you have a light shape and a dark shape, my blending brush, the Zen and Langnickel, is that the name? I think so. Royal and Langnickel Zen series works really well. You just scrub it, you clean it, dab it so that it's just moist but not really wet, and you just scrub the edge, then use a paper towel. It works really well in blending these shapes, and it commands a different type of focus. So what you end up with is a composition where the sides are a little out of focus. You can really see it on the other side too, by the way. The sides really are out of focus, and it tells you where to focus on, like that gemstone at the top. That one's really sharp and takes a lot of attention. So as you see here, this was a very long, arduous, patience-requiring process. But to be honest with you, some parts I did feel like I'm trying to be patient, but for the most part, I was along for the ride and just seeing and discovering what it's going to end up looking like. So it wasn't really a lot of effort necessarily involved, but a lot of just staying in for the ride. So let me do just a recap. Here's the sketch. Here's a bit of a zoom in, traced it all very carefully in a dark room to make sure I get all the details in, simplified the gemstones to just a grid, but very careful with the grid, started filling in those gemstones. Here's a zoomed in view, continued slowly but surely, just trusting the process, continued more. Here's the zoom in of that. More and more, the more details I added, the more it started making sense. Added a background, got a bit more context, darkened everything to the appropriate value, and this is what we have. I hope you enjoyed this one. Just like many of you who've commented below, a lot of people said, you know, once in a while I feel like doing something like this, and then I find it very rewarding. I'm the same way. Usually I don't go for these kinds of works. They're very arduous. They're a big commitment. But when I do, when I choose to, it's because I'm really in the mood for it and I really, really feel like doing it. This is a great example of that. So I really hope you enjoyed seeing this process and following it along with me, even though it's not a video process, but just the snapshots of the stages. I tend to do that a lot lately because I need to really focus on these paintings. I do encourage you, if you want to learn how to paint like me, not necessarily like this art, arduous, long process, but more let go, let the paint do its thing. Check out the frustration-free watercolor course. I do appreciate anyone who joins my courses. It means a lot to me, and it's what allows me to continue having a career as an artist, and I hope to always share tons of information with you. So if you want to be a big part of that, be sure to check out my courses. Also check out Patreon. That's a great way to passively support my work. You can donate, whatever, $1, $2, $3, $5 a month, and it's actually huge help. It's very interesting because right now I hear from everyone around me, and I feel it a bit, that the market is down. So my sales they're not the usual. They're a little slower, but I'm super grateful because things still sell. People still join the courses. But especially now at these times, I have to thank from the bottom of my heart to anyone who supports me over on Patreon. It's just a great supplement. Gives me a lot of freedom and peace of mind mostly, and I do want to thank you. If you want to get credited at the end of my videos and be a big part of that, you can check it out, link in the description box below. Thank you so much. I will see you in the next vid. Until next time, take care and keep creating.